Good morning, class. For this week's discussion board question, I decided to answer question number 3. The question asks, what distinguished the transitional period between 1971 and 1990? The transitional period between 1971 and 1990 can be distinguished simply as it says, transitioning between how the United States was before the Cold War and all the changes that took place to how the United States is currently seen and what currently takes place. The transitional period between 1971 and 1990 deals with two prominent themes, which are changes in the international economic system and the decline in military and political powers. Much of these changes in the international economic system deal with the United States no longer taking part in the requirements of the gold standard, which means you have to have enough gold to back up all the paper money that is produced. The United States left this concept and no longer took part in the requirements of it. There was a rise in oil prices known as the oil shocks in 1973 and 1977. Many countries depended on oil, and this caused an increase in economic competition, specifically taking place in the Middle East. Political and military issues began to take place with the economic decline. Finance in the war in Vietnam became costly for the United States, as well as unpopular among many Americans, which caused political problems for those in office because the war continued to linger on, as well as problems for the military because many came back unappreciated and received much criticism. So this decline. But this obviously took place before the transitional period, but these policies and problems played a role in the transitional period because the way that the military was viewed, the way politics was viewed, the way politics was handled, and also continue to play a role in the economic decline because, like I said, the war in Vietnam had to be financed, and a lot of money and funds went into financing the war in Vietnam, which caused these continuing problems into the transitional period into 1971. And they would soon have to find ways to fix these problems going further into the transitional period, the 1980s and the 1990s. So military competitions between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War played a role in these military and political issues, and these political and military issues became a prominent aspect of the transitional period because it would give way for how the decisions would be made as far as these aspects into the future. So, foreign competitors began to surpass American industry like Europe and Japan as the United States became less inventive because of all these economic and other issues taking place. The transitional period is important to the base for the globalization system because the collapse of communism, just quoting Snow here, Snow mentioned it, quote, provides a political benchmark of that emergence with some economic ramifications for the rise of globalization. And Snow also argues the fall of communism concluded this economic competition between socialism and capitalism. The United States' place in the world plays a prominent role in globalization because of participation in the global economy, going from an isolationist country before 1971 to becoming internationalism, and after the fall of the Soviet Union, the United States and capitalism began to flourish. So we went from this isolationist before to this internationalism and taking part in free markets and the global economy. So because the United States became a runner in the front as far as participating in free trade, no longer keeps this isolationist perspective, which once dominated the United States. And then Snow mentions an economic phenomenon between 1980 and 1990. And the major contribution during the 1980s was the reassertion of the capitalist market based economies because communism began to fall because communism fell after the Soviet Union. During the Cold War there was an economic During the Cold War there was an economic competition based on capitalism and communism. Which one they competed which one is the best for the international system. Well, since the Soviet Union fell, the United States was able to rise above and capitalism dominated the international system again, which continues to this day and plays a dominant role in the globalizing economy today. The reverse of politics that began during the transitional period, for example, Ronald Reagan in the 1980s believed less government interference and less control over the economy for the government, like less government intrusion. And this was a fairly new idea because prior governments played a huge role in the economies of the United States, like deciding to keep the United States as an isolationist country for so long. This began to change with Reagan pushing for a pure form of capitalism, less government, and allowing the private sector to influence the economy because this, quote, was a better decision than government. And much of these ideas became adopted by Clinton into the 1990s, as well as Snow mentioned the British Prime Minister also adopted some of these ideas. So as far as globalization in the economy, this spread of capitalism was continued to spread throughout the globalizing economy and had greater influence on the globalizing economy. So to conclude, this idea of the transitional period formed the base for the globalization system today because of the current dominance of capitalism after the fall of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The participation the United States began to take place in the global economy, which is still seen today, moving from this isolationist to internationalism, and the reverse of politics and decreased government involvement in the global economy, concepts still used today. So thank you for visiting my posts and can't wait to hear responses.